The following question guided my research as I completed my studies. Did pensions of Civil War veterans potentially suffering from combat trauma play a role in any ongoing recovery following the conflict? How did society's different reactions to pensions affect their recovery? Did those reactions hinder their recovery? Did the struggle to get a pension help or hinder a veteran's recovery? And finally, what effect did the pension and the struggle for the pension have on the veteran's beneficiaries, particularly after the veteran's death? We paid attention to veterans suffering from invisible wounds, like those potentially suffering from combat trauma, but ones with physical wounds that just could not be seen. Amputees forming only a small portion of the total number of Civil War veterans who were wounded. Little is known about the effect of pensions on the Civil War soldier, owing in part to the lack of records. Many historians just did not bother to ask these questions. Most records just explore the fact that they got them. There are some more detailed accounts based on the popularity or fame of a soldier, but most of the Civil War soldiers did not enjoy that level of notoriety or infamy or whatever term you wish to use for it. And their records pretty much don't exist outside of the standard pension record. Understanding the effect that these pensions had on the Civil War veterans helps us to better understand what their experience was like after the war. If they struggled for the pension, this could have prevented some ongoing recovery, particularly if they needed some kind of special care, such as an artificial limb, surgery, or specific care by someone with experience in mental health problems and the like. The comparison of these veterans' experiences with the modern veterans can provide some insight into the development of the system and some of the pitfalls that veterans can still fall into that may have existed back then, may have developed over time, may have changed slightly. The only way to know is to study what the system was like from beginning to end. By establishing a study at the beginning of that period, when the pension system in its more modern form was initially created, this allows us to create a starting point, a launch pad of sorts, to look at how veterans have been treated in regards to their pensions, in regards to their disability pay in the 160 years since that war. For this study, I conducted a lot of research. Primary sources included several state archives, some that were included in ancestry.com, others in familysearch.org, many maintained by the states themselves in various .gov websites. The National Archives records for both Union and Confederate pension files contained most of the information about the application for a pension and any ongoing struggles they might have had in proving or disproving a disability, a fight for recognition. Government records that were accessed include all of the acts of Congress from 1862 on up through the early 20th century, as well as the United States War Department's War of the Rebellion compilation of official records for both of the armies in the conflict. House documents from 1874 were also consulted. Surgeon certificates and pension records for individual soldiers. Department of Veteran Affairs records were also referenced. In some of the later research, Americans with Disability Act legislation was reviewed. The primary research methodology was to go into the files and look for records that could provide information. Now, initially this started with some of the more famous soldiers because more was written about them, both inside the pension records and outside of the pension records. And in the process, other names would come up and then those files would be explored in detail. Supplemental research was done in secondary books and articles to provide more modern insight into the problem, differing viewpoints from various historians, economists, psychologists, and others in order to provide a more full picture, a integrated approach to examining how the Civil War soldiers experienced their life after the war, how it affected them, how they were treated by society, how they were treated by the government, and so on and so forth. Having completed the research up to this point, My first finding was that more study is needed. This study for this course is going to serve as a launch pad for a larger study that will be taken up in my dissertation. For now, I can say that the veterans of the Civil War faced a long fight after the war was over to get their pensions. Some of them lasted for decades, trying to get recognition of their disability. Initially, some of them weren't getting anything, and then when they finally did get support, it didn't backdate until later. The veterans' beneficiaries faced a lot of struggles keeping their support after the veteran passed away. In particular, widows who would then remarry later faced a lot of, there's no better word for it, persecution over getting the benefit because they didn't remain a solitary widow, which involved even more study into how the society reacted to these men and women. There was a lot of judgment going on. There was moralizing, legislating morality involved in this process. And all of this served just to hinder the recovery of these veterans and hinder the passage through grief that these beneficiaries would go through. American citizens of that era had a predisposition against laziness and malingering, and they became more critical and less generous as the 19th century came to a close. This was complicated by deeply held religious beliefs on mental capacity, the role of men in society, the warrior culture, work ethic, and similar things. And all of this served to create a stigmatization that did nothing but ostracize these veterans who were suffering from these wounds. Because of the stigmatization and the ostracization, a lot of these veterans could not get help in public. Their families were forced to care for them, often in private, or they were hidden away in asylums that were later called veteran homes that treated them like inmates or soldiers, heavily controlling their lives, deciding what they could and could not do, many things like that. All of this served to create a heavy burden on both the veteran and their families, and often ended in tragedy, either a veteran suffering for their entire life until they finally died from the wound, or them ending their life in a tragic and sudden way, to them just living an isolated, frightened existence to the end of their day. After all was said and done, all of these paths led to the same location for all of these veterans: a prolonged, torturous position inflicted upon them by an unwitting, often ignorant, and sometimes uncaring nation that fought against helping these wounded warriors nearly as hard as those men had once fought to preserve the Union.